You're listening to Marks of a Healthy Church, a Sunday school series taught by the elders and deacons of Maple City Baptist Church in Chatham, Ontario. For more information about Maple City, please visit us online at maplecitybaptistchurch.com.
So for the last 4 weeks, we've been going through a study on the subject of prayer, and we'll continue for a few more weeks at least. And I've found it helpful. I think over the past 6 months or so, God has really been teaching me more about my need to pray. And so it's been good for me to go through that, and then good for me once again to prepare for these lessons and go through some of the prayers of godly men and women throughout the church history and throughout our faith history, even back in the Old Testament. And so we'll continue that process this morning with Nehemiah. A few weeks ago, we let Charles Spurgeon introduce the topic of prayer. Just looked at some of his great quotes on prayer. And then last week, we looked at John Stott. And before I get into the introducer for this week, I'm wondering, because it got me thinking this week, those are some of my authors that I turn to, but I'm wondering if you have any authors that you particularly like to read. Like, who is your favorite Christian author? If you could read or recommend one book or author, who would it be other than the Bible? Because we know all you good Christians will say, just read the Bible, right? Bernie.
Charles Swindoll's got a whole series on characters in the Bible that's just phenomenal.
Okay, Charles Swindoll. Yeah, cool, absolutely.
David Jeremiah.
David Jeremiah. All right, good. Both those guys are on the radio too, so look at that. Authors that you find very helpful in your walk. Yeah. Jen Wilkin. Yeah, she's good. She writes a book called Women of the Word. It's one of the best books I've read about reading the Bible. I'm not a woman, but it was still helpful. Yeah, it was really good.
John MacArthur is a good book on prayer.
John MacArthur on prayer. I would imagine it'd be very good. I haven't read it.
Let's just say Tozer.
Yeah, Tozer. Good. Who else? No? All right. There's a lot of good authors out there. I'm going through J.I. Packer's book, Knowing God, and it's fantastic. He's an amazing writer. But our subject this morning, our introducer this morning is C.S. Lewis. Lewis is another amazing author, incredible author. And I think probably with most Christian authors, there are going to be little areas of doctrine that we're different than, C.S. Lewis is one of those guys that when I read him, he really makes me think. And sometimes I think that maybe he's wrong, but he still really makes me think. And so I wanted to use some of the things that he said about prayer, and then in particular look at a book that we're reading together with the guys. And so Lewis said this. He said, "We must lay before him what is in us, not what ought to be in us." I think that's just an important reminder of our need to be honest in prayer and open in prayer. And we've said that a few times already. He also said prayer, in the sense of petition, asking for things, is a small part of it. Confession and penitence are its threshold, adoration its sanctuary, the presence and vision and enjoyment of God its bread and wine. And I think that's a nice quote that kind of reminds us that prayer is more than just asking God to change things in your life or in somebody else's life. Prayer is more than just petition. Okay, when we look at the prayers of the Bible, there are certainly petitions, requests that are presented, but so much of their prayers dealt with the character of God and what God had done in the past and who God was and how glorious He is. And then confession was a big part of those prayers as well. And for us, I think it's kind of like, "Dear Jesus, you're awesome. Sorry that I'm a sinner. These are my list of things that I want." And I think we got to look at how we spend our time in prayer, and it should be more about God, more of a God-focused prayer. And then it puts us in the right frame of mind to present our requests to Him. So one of the books that I read when I was a young believer, I was, I think, 17 years old, and I'd been saved at 16. It's probably the first Christian book I read was called Screwtape Letters. How many people have read that? Okay, so Screwtape Letters, if you've read it, you know, but if you haven't, it's kind of a weird way of looking at things. It is written from the perspective of a demon who is writing letters to a younger, inexperienced demon, trying to teach that demon how to mess up the life of this person who is at first not a Christian and then becomes a Christian. And so it's a very weird perspective, because as you read the book, when it says the enemy, it's talking about God, and when it says our Father below, it's talking about Satan. And so it's always kind of the reversed angle of what, but it really does a great job of bringing out the spiritual warfare that we're in, and how Satan might use things in our lives to distract us and to pull us away from the things of God. And in particular, a chapter on prayer was helpful for me when I was younger, because it kind of helped me to realize how my prayers even might be used to get me off course. And so I want to read from Screwtape Letters, chapter 4, just a few portions of it. And remember, this is the advice that an older demon is giving to a younger demon, okay? He says, the best thing, where it is possible, is to keep the patient from the serious intention of praying altogether. When the patient is an adult, recently converted to the enemy's party like your man, this is best done by encouraging him to remember, or to think he remembers, the parrot-like nature of his prayers in his childhood. In reaction against that, he may be persuaded to aim at something entirely spontaneous, inward, informal, and unregularized. That's not how you say that. And what this will actually mean to a beginner will be an effort to produce in himself a vaguely devotional mood in which real concentration of will and intelligence have no part. Okay, I think that was really interesting, because what he's saying is sometimes we balk so much at the idea of having a prayer that is really doctrine-filled. Even a prayer like the Lord's Prayer, like the Our Father, that is already kind of written out for us, that instead we're trying to create this sense, this mood of prayer, this feeling of prayer, this feeling of intense devotion to God, intimacy with God, our prayer becomes more about how we feel. Right? It's like we're trying to produce in ourselves the right feelings that we're not really including our will and our intelligence. And that's a problem, right? It's a good thing to think while you're praying, to think through the character of God and who He is and what He's done when we pray. When you look at the prayers of the Bible, it doesn't seem like it's the same phrase just repeated over and over again, kind of like some 7-Eleven Christian worship songs, right? That you hear the same thing about God. And yes, that's true and it's good, but these prayers are so doctrinally rich. And I think we should strive for that in our prayer. So then he continues, and he says, at the very least, they can be persuaded that the bodily position makes no difference to their prayers. For they constantly forget what you must always remember, that they are animals, and that whatever their bodies do affect their souls. I thought that was kind of another interesting reminder. Have you ever actually kneeled before your bed to pray? Done that before? Tried it? How does it feel? Humble, right? Isn't it weird? Isn't it weird that changing your bodily position, it changes your frame of mind? And I think that's helpful to remember. I'm not saying that you need to every night, have some prayer bench that you kneel before, but I think just remembering that, and every once in a while getting on our knees, or even laying on the floor before God in prayer, that's a helpful thing. Even putting your hand in the air, which I know I don't do, so I'm a little bit of a hypocrite, but that actually, when you do that and you're worshiping, it just changes something about how you're feeling and thinking, and I don't know. So those things, it's common in the Bible to see these acts of devotion accompanied by a physical posture that reflects the devotion, right? And so he's reminding us of that. He then goes on, whenever they are attending to the enemy himself, we are defeated. Okay, so get what he just said. He says, whenever they're really focusing on God, we are defeated. But there are ways of preventing them from doing so. The simplest is to turn their gaze away from Him toward themselves. Keep them watching their own minds and trying to produce feelings, thereby the action of their own wills. When they are meant to ask for charity, let them instead start trying to manufacture charitable feelings for themselves and not notice that that is what they're doing. When they're meant to pray for courage, let them really be trying to feel brave. When they say they're praying for forgiveness, let them be trying to feel forgiven. Teach them to estimate the value of each prayer by their success in producing the desired feelings. And I think it's neat that in this book, he even makes the point where that some of the prayers that are probably the most effective or the most worship-filled, the most glorifying to God, are the times that we go to God and we say things that are true about God, and we ask Him for His help, and we ask Him for forgiveness, and we ask Him to be with us, even though we don't feel that way. When you choose to make a conscious decision in your mind and in your will, right, your decision-making center, your heart, to go even against your feeling and worship God, that's powerful, right? Sometimes we let our feelings dictate everything about us. And it's like when we don't feel all the right things, we haven't prayed right. And sometimes you go to God and you might not feel all the right things, but the fact that when you don't feel it, you still go to God is worshipful. You still say the right things. You still are thinking the right things, even if, do you see what I'm saying? So I think that's a really good thing that he brings up.
He wasn't praying. He was actually thankful that he was suffering.
Right. And so saying some things that might not feel to be the case at the time. Yeah. But of course, the enemy will not be idle. Wherever there is prayer, there is a danger of his own immediate action. He is cynically indifferent to the dignity of his position and ours as pure spirits, and to the human animals on their knees. He pours out self-knowledge in a quite shameless fashion. God pours out knowledge of Himself when we go to Him with the right attitude of prayer. He goes on, but if He defeats your first attempt at misdirection, we have a subtler weapon. The humans do not start from that direct perception of Him, which we, unhappily, cannot avoid. Okay? So we don't see Him as clearly as maybe the demons have seen Him. And this is how he describes that. They have never known that ghastly luminosity, that stabbing and searing glare, which makes the background of permanent pain into our lives. If you look into your patient's mind when he is praying, you will not find that. And that was just like a reminder that we pray to this God and we know Him, but we still haven't seen Him face to face. And that He is so almighty and so glorious and so awesome that we can't even fathom the God we go to. And so what he's saying is that remember that this is a benefit that we have that they don't see Him fully yet. And that should just be a reminder to us how glorious He is. So, I'll conclude his final paragraph in this chapter. He says, for if he ever comes to make that distinction, and the distinction is between praying to God, to the real God that exists, to the attributes as He's made Himself known to us, rather than praying to a God of our imagination or to a symbol that we view as God, when we're really praying directly to the God of heaven. If we ever come to make that distinction, if He ever consciously directs His prayers, not to what I think Thou art, but to what Thou knowest Thyself to be, our situation is, for the moment, desperate. Once all his thoughts and images have been flung aside, and the man trusts himself to the completely real, external, invisible presence, there will be with him in the room and never knowable by him as he is known by it. Why, then, it is that the incalculable may occur. In avoiding this situation, this real nakedness of the soul in prayer, you will be helped by the fact that the humans themselves do not desire it as much as they suppose. There's such a thing as getting more than they bargained for. And that's just like a reminder that we must go to God, to the God who is, and we must go to Him the way we are. And when we go to the God who is with real nakedness of soul, right? Real honesty and transparency before him. The incalculable may occur. So that's Screwtape Letters was a book that was helpful to me, and hopefully that chapter, that paragraph has been helpful to you as well. All right. Nehemiah. We talked last week about the first couple prayers Nehemiah prayed. It's how to pray while in the battle. And so, if you remember, Nehemiah was writing during a time that Israel was enslaved. And Nehemiah was one of the servants of Artaxerxes, right? The king. He was the cupbearer. And so he had a great position there, but he found out that back in his hometown, or back in his land, in Jerusalem, the town was in ruins. The wall had been torn down. The enemies could take and whatever they wanted, they could do whatever they wanted with the Israelites. And the people there were in great distress, and they were shamed. They were humiliated. And so, what was the report he was given was that things were really, really bad there. And you remember what his response was? He wept, he mourned, he fasted, and then he prayed. And he prayed this prayer, such an amazing prayer. It was a prayer of contrition, it was a prayer of repentance, of confession, both corporately and individually. It was a prayer that exalted God and who he was. It was a prayer that talked about what God had done and that he was just in what he had done. It was a prayer that clung to God's promises that if they were to repent, that he would help them. And then it was a prayer that at the end, he asked God for his personal help. God, I need you to help me as I attempt to do something about this problem. And so a great prayer that's an example for us. Then we saw the second prayer in Nehemiah's life as he finally, after 4 months of praying that prayer, is given the opportunity to speak to the king. The king says, why is your countenance so low? Why do you look so sad, Nehemiah? And this isn't a good deal for Nehemiah. Nehemiah shouldn't be sad in the presence of the king, but he is, and Nehemiah takes the opportunity to pray first, get down on his knees and pray. We don't know what he said. It's probably, Jesus, help me, except maybe God help me. And then he told the king what the problem was. How could I be happy? How could I be okay when my people, my hometown, it's in ruins? It's destroyed. They're shamed. They're humiliated. How could I be okay right now? And in response, the king does way more than he could ever imagine. He gives him all the time he needs to go back to help fix the problem. He sends him with servants. He sends him with his credit card. Right? He allows him to get whatever supplies he needs to go rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. And so Nehemiah sets out in chapter 3. In chapter 2, even before the work begins, I think it's interesting to notice that when Nehemiah leaves, before it even says he gets there and before he surveys, in verse 10 it says, when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, heard of it, it grieved them exceedingly that there was come a man to seek the welfare of the children of Israel. So even before he arrives, the enemies of God are grieved that somebody is going to help Israel. So Nehemiah arrives in Jerusalem. Yeah.
At this point, Ezra had already started the rebuilding of the temple.
Yeah, the temple had been probably rebuilt 13 years prior or so. And so they had initiated sacrifices and things going on there, but because of the state of the wall, it was not long before Jerusalem was in ruins again, and the people that were living there, a lot of them moved out, and it was kind of just...
And that's when Tobiah had a room in the temple, right?
That was at the end. No, that's the end of Nehemiah. Yeah, that's kind of like all of this is great in Nehemiah, and at the end it's like, but human beings still suck, right? And so, like, just because they had this wonderful revival, which it was, doesn't mean that their problems are all fixed. Like the Messiah still needs to come. But Tobiah is one of the enemies that's spoken of throughout this whole thing. And so, even before he gets there, they're against the work. He's in Jerusalem for 3 days to survey, doesn't tell anybody he's there. And finally he calls like a group meeting, and it's kind of like a pep rally. And he says, this is what God has done. This is how he's allowed me to come back. This is what I propose we do. God is going to strengthen our arm to do it. And so let's rebuild this wall. And all of Jerusalem, the people that are there, they get excited about the work that they believe God is going to do. But even as that's happening in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 19, the people, the enemies, are mocking. It says, but Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arabian heard it. They laughed us to scorn, and they despised us, and said, what is this thing that you're doing? Will you rebel against the king? Right? They're already like laughing at them, and then like putting this little like, are you going to rebel against the king? Because we're going to tell him. You know, this thought in their head, like there's going to be problems in the future. Nehemiah's response is wonderful. He said, the God of heaven, he will prosper us. You like the whole time you're going to see this is Nehemiah's response. The God of heaven will help us. Yeah, you're right. Looks crazy. How could we ever do this? How are we going to do this thing? No, we're just weak, measly little Israel. But the God of heaven will help us. Chapter 3 is great. It reads kind of like a work day at the church, right? It's got this person did this, he repaired this gate, and this person repaired this gate, and this person cut down this tree, and this person was pulling the logs and putting them through the shipper, and this person was doing this, and this was happening. And so chapter 3 is just a great chapter of like, the work is getting done. Things are happening. And so, as you might imagine, this early success is met with more hostility. Nehemiah chapter 4 verse 1 says, when Sanballat heard that we had builded the wall, he was wroth, he was angry, and he took great indignation, and he mocked the Jews. And he spake before his brethren in the army of Syria. So here's this guy, this king, who is an enemy of God, and he stands before his army. Like he's saying this openly in front of all the people. What do these feeble Jews do? Will they fortify themselves? Will they sacrifice? Will they make an end in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish which are burned? Right? You can sense the sarcasm dripping from his words. Like, these people, are you kidding me? Is there any chance that these weak Jews will ever be able to strengthen themselves and get back to their sacrificing and taking this rubbish that is Jerusalem and making it into something special? Like, there's no way. And so Tobiah chimes in. Tobiah the Ammonite was by him, and he said, even that which they build, if a fox goes up it, he shall break down their stone wall. I like how he said that because it's clever. It's funny, right? Tobiah, you know what? If they were to build it, I can guarantee you, if a fox ran up that wall, he would knock it over. That's how pathetic these people are. They could never build anything worth that's going to stand. You know, they're the laughing stock of everyone around them. So these people have been set out on a mission to do something that God wants done, that Nehemiah has been kind of commissioned to do and strengthened to do and given the resources to do. And he goes back and he gets his pep rally going. Before he even gets there, it starts. They're there and they're being laughed at. And now there's like this whole group of people, the whole army of Samaria that's laughing at them and making jokes about them. This is weird because they're doing God's work. So don't you think they should be respected? No. Verse 4. This is their response. Hear, O our God, for we are despised, and turn their reproach upon their own head. Give them for a prey in the land of captivity, and cover not their iniquity, and let not their sin be blotted out from before thee, for they have provoked thee to anger before the builders. He says, God, he doesn't respond to them. He's not trying to have a good comeback like you might in a schoolyard brawl. Instead, he turns to God. He says, God, you hear what's going on. You see that we're despised. You know the enemies and the difficulties that we're facing. And all he prays is, God, whatever they pray for us, I hope that happens to them. And it's interesting because I think sometimes, we hear the words of Christ, pray for your enemies, love your enemies, you don't despise them. And we're trying to square that with some of the prayers we find in the Old Testament. Here, he prays that they would be prey in the land of captivity, that the reproach would be on their head, that God would not cover their iniquities or let their sin be blotted out. And that kind of seems mean. But I want you to see that in this case, all he is doing is saying, we're not going to deal with this, God. We're not going to worry about them. We're going to keep doing the work you've called us to, and we're going to trust you to deal with them. Do to them what's just. And we see that in Psalms, where David or other psalmists are writing and saying, God, deal with these people, judge them according to your word. That's kind of what he's doing here. So what he's doing is he's handing this problem over to God. Now, I think that it's okay for us to struggle with people and to give that to God and say, God, deal with this person. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm not going to try and get my own vengeance or revenge. I'm going to hand that person over to you, deal with them. But I think at the same time, there's that balance of, but I've been forgiven, and I want to see others experience your grace too. And this is a hard thing. This is kind of what Jonah was wrestling with, right? Jonah didn't want the Ninevites, who were really evil, to experience God's grace and his mercy. So there's some kind of balance that's going on there. But we definitely see here that he's able to hand the problem over to God and say, God, act justly toward them, give them what they deserve. Goes on in verse 8, there's more progress made after he prays this prayer, but the progress on the wall prompts more problems, more enemies. And so they kind of upgrade this mocking and laughing to physical violence. In verse 8, it says, they conspired all of them together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to hinder it. So the verbal attacks don't work, so they escalate it to, okay, making fun of them is not enough, let's go fight them. Verse 9, nevertheless, we made our prayer unto our God, and we set watch against them day and night because of them. So what does he do when people come against them, when people are making fun of them? God, deal with them. What does he do when physical attacks start coming? God, deal with them. Help us, right? But it's always turning to God. But do you notice that the prayer in verse 9 is coupled with some kind of action? It says, and they set watch against them day and night because of them. So he prays this prayer, but he's not just like this, okay, God, just do it all, and we're going to sit back and twiddle our thumbs. It's, God, we need your help. We need you to protect us. Hey, guys, maybe while you're, working, you should have a sword on your belt. Or maybe like hammer in one hand, sword in the other hand. Hey, let's set up a watch so that just if they come at night, they're being wise, right? They're making sure that they're doing what they can and then asking God to do everything. And I think that's a great pattern for us to follow in our lives. That as we encounter problems or we face injustice or people are against us, that we do what we can, what's wise in that situation, but then we still give it to God and expect God to do everything. Right? And so I think these are good lessons for us. It's a good pattern for us. Now, yes.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Doing it ourselves or doing what we can, isn't that sort of, when we know what we ought to do, and we do it, like it's just an act of faith. We
Yes.
do what we believe we should do in faith, and then we give everything to God anyway.
Right, absolutely. It is. Nehemiah is probably the greatest book in the Bible that helps us to see how prayer and action go hand in hand. And you never get the sense that Nehemiah is showing a lack of faith because he's acting. It's always he's acting in line with his faith, believing that God will do what he's promised and believing that God will answer his prayers. And so that's why he acts. And I think just sometimes we can get the attitude of like, I've got to do it all, and we don't remember that we need to pray and that really God has to do it all. And then we can get the other attitude of, okay, God, you're just going to have to do all this, and I'm just going to sit back and wait for you to do it all. And that's not faith either, right? So the book is really helpful to help us to see how those things go hand in hand. So the enemies, all this praying, doesn't stop the enemies from plotting, right? In verse 11 it says, our adversary said, they shall not know, neither see, till we come in the midst among them, and we slay them and cause their work to cease. So the enemies, it's not like they pray this prayer and then all of a sudden God changes their mind and removes the whole problem. The enemies keep coming. And so what has changed here is that the people are relying fully on God, and though they weren't delivered from the danger, they were brought safely through it. Right? And that is so often how God answers our prayers. And so many times, I know if your prayers are like mine, we're praying that God changes something. We change the circumstance, make this person better, help this situation. And obviously that's how we feel. That's our flesh that says, I want the suffering to cease. But so often the answer to prayer is not, the situation is different. The answer to prayer is that God walks that person through the suffering. Right? That he goes through them with it, and he gives them the strength and the endurance and whatever it is that they need to get through it. And so that is what happens here. The prayer number 5. We find this prayer in chapter 5. Now, with all these problems that are going on without, there are problems arising from within. Now, from within this group of Israelites, the people are incredibly poor. They have no money to buy food. They have already mortgaged their houses. They've taken loans out that they can't pay back, and they're starting to having to send their children to go work as slaves. But part of the problem of all of this is that these loans and these mortgages are being bought by or being given by fellow Jews. And you think that this whole group of people is working toward this common goal of building the wall, and now within this group of Jews, you have the workers unable to eat because some of the noblemen have loans against them, and now they have to serve them. And it's not helping the work of God at all because the people are fighting from within. And so, Nehemiah tries to correct this problem. And I think it's interesting that his prayer doesn't come at this point. He doesn't go to God and say, God, tell me what I should say to them. Tell me what I should do. And it's possible that he prayed and it's just not recorded here. But I kind of wonder if the reason he didn't pray at that point was because he didn't need to. He knew what was right. He knew what God wanted. Right? He knew what he was supposed to do, so he didn't need to go to God and say, God, what should I do? So instead, he goes to the people and he says, guys, this isn't right. You should not be taking these massive loans and charging interest to your own people when we're trying to do this work. I want you to forgive their loans. Don't worry about it. Let's work together in this common good. And so it seems like the people do that. And so the work can continue. And then he describes a little bit about the work that he's doing there and the fact that he's kind of living a very, we say, not poor, but he's not living like a governor, right? He's not taking a huge salary. He's not got lots of servants. He's not eating the best food. And so in verse 19, he says this prayer, and I want to know your thoughts on this prayer. He says, think upon me, my God, for good, according to all that I have done for this people. Okay, what comes to your mind when he says that? Lord, think on me for good, according to what I've done for this people. What do you think? What's your gut reaction?
He wants to take the credit himself.
Okay, so maybe he wants to take the credit himself?
I think he's asking the Lord to examine himself.
Okay, to examine him. Anybody else? Maybe he's asking for mercy? Yeah. I mean, I think that this prayer in Nehemiah 5:19 is echoed a few times, something similar in verse 13, and I think there he's definitely asking for mercy too.
I think what I get from this, God, you know that I've just wanted your will. I don't know what else to do.
Yeah.
Intervene because I've done all that I can. Remember me, Lord. I didn't do it for me or for any kind of exaltation. I did it for you and for your glory.
Yeah, I think that's about it. I think that in this case, if this prayer was all by itself and we read it, we'd probably go, well, that was kind of selfish. Lord, think about me for good, according to all that I've done for these people. It kind of sounds selfish, right? It kind of sounds self-centered. But I think part of what we're seeing is, in that whole chapter, Nehemiah has been selfless, right? He's shown his willingness to sacrifice for the people, to do God's work and to not take anything for himself. And now, instead of forcing, he was in a position where he could force a greater wage. He could demand better food. He could demand better living accommodations. He was just saying, God, it's in your hands. You think upon me for good. You know what I've done. You know my sacrifice. And so I'm putting it in your hands rather than forcing it in my own way. And so I think that probably it's a less of a prayer of selfishness and kind of a prayer of faith. God, it's in your hands. Prayer number 6. We have time for this. How to pray when people are trying to stop the work of God. So the persecution is getting worse, right? Still not alleviated. The enemies of Israel now trying to kill Nehemiah directly. It begins with a plan to trick him into leaving the work and meeting them far away, about 48 kilometers away, from Jerusalem so that they can do him harm, right? Their desire is to stop the rebuilding. They know that if they cut off the head of the serpent, they cut off Nehemiah, that the whole project will fail. And so, hey, Nehemiah, we just want to meet with you. We just want, to chat. Let's just have a talk. How about we meet in this village and come by yourself and we'll just have a nice tea together. And you know what they're trying to do. And so they send 4 letters directly to Nehemiah asking this. And every single time his response is, how could I leave the great work that I'm doing here to sit and have tea with you guys? God has given me this work to do. I'm going to do this work. I'm not going to leave it. And so stop bothering me. It's not going to happen, guys. So they changed their tactic with the 5th letter. This time the letter is an open letter. And an open letter is a letter that is not meant to be read before Nehemiah. It's meant to be read before everybody, right? And this letter, why don't I have it here? Okay, turn to chapter 6, verse 7. Chapter 6, verse 6. Okay. There we go. Okay, chapter 6, verse 6. So this is what the letter says. Wherein was written, it was reported among the heathen, and Gashmu said it, that thou and the Jews think to rebel, for which cause thou buildest the wall, that thou mayest be their king according to these words. And thou hast also appointed prophets to preach of thee at Jerusalem, saying, there is no king in Judah. And now shall it be reported to the king according to these words. Come now, therefore, and let us take counsel together. So they say, before everybody, hey, just so you know, word on the street is, and even Gashmu said it, which we don't know who Gashmu is, but it's kind of funny to think that there was this guy named Gashmu who, if he said it, it must be true. Gashmu said it, that you and the Jews are planning a rebellion. That you're building a wall so that you can become the king. And what you're doing is you're appointing prophets to preach at Jerusalem, saying that there is a king in Judah. And now, we're going to go back and tell your king, Artaxerxes. So, do you see how subtle this is? How really a smart plan this is on their behalf? That it didn't work to invite him. It didn't work. They couldn't convince him on their own. So now they're going to spread the word about the selfishness of Nehemiah, about the fact that he's doing this for his own gain, that he's motivated by the desire to be king, and that he's going to mount a rebellion so that this other, far more powerful king will come and squash it. And so he's saying, all you need to do for this gossip to stop, all you need to do to put an end to all these words is come and meet with us so that we can kill you. But they didn't say that part, right? And so Nehemiah once again has an amazing response. This is one of my favorite verses in the Bible. He says, then I said unto him, there are no such things done as thou sayest, for thou feignest them out of thine own heart. He says, what you're saying didn't happen. You made it up in your own mind. Alistair Begg used to respond to letters that he received with the verse Nehemiah 6:8. If the letters were making up things that he said or saying bad things about his church or about him or whatever, he would just write back Nehemiah 6:8. You're making up things out of your own mind. These things didn't happen. And so he's got this amazing response. And it is so courageous, right? It's so brilliant. Like you think of Nehemiah as he's this awesome leader who stands up and he says these words, and you're so impressed with him. And I love how the Word of God, the way it's written, it's like, for they all made us afraid. Like, he wasn't this super courageous, powerful guy. He had the right response here, or he was, but it wasn't because he was that in himself, because the next verse tells us that they were terrified. They all made us afraid, right? They were scared. And so he says these things in the midst of this fear that he's facing. And so his prayer is, at the end of verse 9, now therefore, O God, strengthen my hands. God, I'm afraid. Trying to kill me. They got these plots. If this word gets back to my king, this could be really bad for us. O God, strengthen my hands. And God does. Constantly, he's going back to God for help, and constantly he's receiving help from God. I think we'll bring it to a close here. We've got at least 3 more prayers to cover next time. And I don't even think we got to your prayer number 5 sheet. And so that'll happen next week as well. But I'm just finding, I think that the prayers of Nehemiah are amazing, but they make so much more sense in the context of the story of Nehemiah. So why don't we just, my thinking was, why don't we kind of cover the story and we'll come across the prayers as they come. And so that's what we're doing, and hopefully it's okay. Thank you for being here today. God bless.